Allied forces report heavy resistance in the northern sector. We are holding the line, but...
March 22, 1945. In the bunker under the Reich Chancellery, the air was thick with coal dust and stale sweat. The concrete walls sweated moisture. Somewhere above, Berlin shook under the distant thump of Soviet artillery feeling for the suburbs. In the map room, under bare bulbs that made everyone look sick, a handful of officers stood around a table that no longer showed a greater German Reich, just shrinking pockets of color drowning in red pencil. Hitler sat hunched in his chair at the head of the table, one hand flat on the green baize, the other curled around a pencil he no longer used. General Alfred Jodl finished reading the latest summary from the Western Front. The American bridgehead east of Remagen now extends 11 kilometers beyond the Rhine, am Misfire. Intelligence estimates between 8 and 10 divisions have crossed so far. Additional bridges have been constructed downstream. Our counterattacks have not succeeded in throwing them back. The pencil in Hitler's hand snapped. He didn't notice at first. He just stared at the broken stub, wood and graphite splintered between his fingers. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, almost conversational. "Who commanded Remagen?" he asked. "Oh, the bridge, the town, the engineers. Every last man responsible for that crossing still standing when the Americans arrived." Jodl glanced at the paper in his hand. He already knew the names. They had been repeated in reports and angry tirades for 2 weeks. A Major Scheller, combat commander of Remagen. Captain Bratch, bridge security. Major Kraft, artillery support. Major Strobel, engineer commander. Lieutenant Peters, demolition detail. Hitler looked up. "Then they will all be shot," he said. He pushed back his chair and stood, the tendons in his neck standing out. The tremor in his left hand made his decorations rattle softly against his tunic. Immediately, for cowardice, for betrayal, for failing to carry out the most simple of orders. He jammed his finger at the map at a thin blue line labeled a Rhine that once had been the last confident stroke between Germany and invasion. Here they have given the enemy our last barrier, the Rhine itself, intact. The absurdity of the date hung over the table, March 22nd. The bridge at Remagen had been captured 15 days earlier, on March 7th. It had already collapsed 10 days ago, on March 17th, under the strain of too much traffic and too many repair explosions. The damage, in reality, was already done. But for Hitler, this day the day he finally ordered every officer connected with Remagen shot and decreed death for any commander who surrendered a bridge intact was the day the betrayal became personal. To understand why that strip of steel at Remagen cut so deep, we have to go back not 15 days, but 15 years. Back to the image he had built in his mind of the Rhine. For Hitler, the Rhine was not just a river, it was a myth. In his speeches throughout the 1930s, he cast it as a Germany's eternal frontier, a sacred line that foreign armies would never cross as long as he lived. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936 had been one of his greatest gambles and greatest propaganda victories. He liked to recall that moment as proof that boldness, not caution, protected Germany. By early 1945, that myth was all but exhausted. In the east, the Vistula had already been crossed. In January, the Red Army had smashed through Army Group A and reached the Oder, less than 100 kilometers from Berlin. In the west, however, many in the German leadership still clung to a fantasy that the Rhine could be held even if everything behind it burned. They told themselves that the Americans and British, wary of casualties, would not risk a river crossing under fire, that it would take them until late spring to bring up bridging equipment and secure air superiority. That perhaps in that time, something a split in the Allied coalition, a miracle weapon, a negotiated separate peace might intervene. Then came March 7, 1945. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was a steel truss span built in the First World War. It carried 2 railway tracks and a pedestrian walkway across one of the widest parts of the Rhine, connecting Remagen on the west bank with Erpel on the east. By March 1945, it was one of the last remaining bridges still standing over the river. Its demolition had been planned for months. German engineers had placed large charges in chambers under the piers, smaller ones under the roadway. Wires ran to a firing point on the east bank. Orders were clear. When American forces closed within artillery range, the bridge was to be destroyed. But reality, as always, was messier. Your demolition cord had been damaged by bombing. Some of the explosives had been moved, then returned, then tampered with. Communications up and down the chain of command were confused, fragmentary, delayed. Units were retreating in disorder through Remagen, desperate to get their vehicles and guns across, while the crossing still existed. Shortly after 1:00 p.m., on March 7th, lead elements of the U.S. 9th Armored Division tanks and Armored Infantry of Combat Command reached the high ground above Remagen. Major General John W. Leonard had not expected to find an intact bridge. No one had. Weeks of bombing had already taken down most of the Rhine crossings north and south. American intelligence assessments called any unharmed span unlikely. Yet there it was. Through the smoke and haze, Lieutenant Karl Timmerman, leading a patrol from a company, 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, saw the dark silhouette of the Ludendorff Bridge still stretching from bank to bank, with German vehicles still rolling east. Reports shot back to division and to 1st Army headquarters. Omar Bradley, hearing the news at his command post, asked twice for confirmation. You mean it's still there? When the answer came back, yes. His response was immediate. Oh, if you can take it, take it. On the German side, panic unfolded in slow motion. At 2:00 DM, Major Hans Scheller took over as town commandant. He found a situation already spiraling. Thousands of troops and refugees jamming the roads, communications collapsing. At 3:00 p.m. As American artillery shells began landing near the abutments, Scheller ordered the bridge blown. Witnesses later recalled 2 plumes of smoke, one from a smaller charge on the approach ramp, another from the main pier demolitions. When the dust cleared, the bridge was still there. The smaller blast had cut a chunk from the roadway, killing some German engineers and soldiers. The main explosion under the central pier had thrown up a column of water and cracked steel, but something had gone wrong. Most of the charges had failed to detonate. Some blamed faulty fuses. Others blamed hastily reconnected wires. Others whispered darker words, sabotage, defeatism. Whatever the cause, the result was now visible to everyone. A wounded, damaged, but still standing path over the Rhine. American commanders did not waste the gift. Under artillery fire, Timmerman's men rushed the western approach. Engineers from the 9th Armored Engineer Battalion followed close behind, cutting wires, throwing unexploded charges into the river, shoring up weak spots with planks and timbers. The first American soldiers to set foot on the east bank of the Rhine did so at 4 p.m. on March 7, 1945. By midnight, hundreds had crossed. By March 10th, tens of thousands. Pontoon and treadway bridges sprouted like steel vines upstream and downstream of the Ludendorff, spreading the load as the damaged structure groaned and sagged. The psychological impact inside Germany was immediate. For ordinary civilians listening to the BBC in secret, the news that Yankee infantry had crossed the unsurmountable Rhine sent a shiver through every whispered conversation. For the general staff, it triggered a different shiver, the knowledge that their last coherent defensive line in the West had been compromised weeks before anyone had expected. For Hitler, informed on the evening of March 7th, it was something else entirely. He flew into a rage, accusing the army of treason, of willfully giving the enemy a bridge. He ordered an investigation. He ordered Luftwaffe attacks, V-2 rockets, even frogmen to strike at the span. The attacks came. In the next 10 days, German aircraft flew hundreds of sorties against Remagen. Me-262 jets, R-234 bombers, anything that could carry a bomb was hurled at the crossing. Artillery batteries along the east bank hurled shells day and night. V-2 rockets, launched from Holland, fell miles away, inaccurate and mostly irrelevant. They managed to damage the already weakened bridge. They did not stop the flow. Engineers reinforced the piers with steel beams and timber. Anti-aircraft guns ringed the approaches. American casualties mounted several hundred killed and wounded in the constant shelling and attacks, but the crossing held until March 17th. At 3:03 a.m. that day, under a normal traffic load, the Ludendorff Bridge finally gave up. With a roar and a shriek of tearing steel, the center of the span dropped into the Rhine, taking dozens of engineers and MP with it. 28 Americans died. Over 90 were injured. Over 90 were injured. For the Americans, it was a tragedy. For Hitler, it was 10 days too late. By then, the Remagen bridgehead was a fact on the map. Several miles deep, anchored by multiple new bridges, U.S. First Army was spreading out across the hills east of the Rhine, preparing to encircle the Ruhr. On March 9th, even before the bridge fell, Hitler had already taken the first step in what would culminate in that March 22nd order. He summoned a fanatical general, Rudolf Hübner, and dispatched him as a flying court-martial to the Remagen sector. His mission: find the officers responsible for the failure at Remagen and make an example of them. Over the next days, Hübner interrogated, judged, and condemned. Major Scheller was arrested. So were Major August Kraft, the artillery commander, Major Herbert Strobel, in charge of the engineer units, and Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Peters, who had supervised the detonations. Captain Willy Brach, commander of the Bridge Guard Company, had already been captured by the Americans. He was tried in absentia on March 14, 1945, not far from the ruins of the bridge they had failed to destroy. Several of these men were shot by firing squads after hasty trials. Their families would not be told the truth. Their names would be buried in files stamped a failing coward. Still, Hitler was not satisfied. As reports from Remagen continued to show American divisions pouring across the river, as news arrived that Patton's Third Army had also forced crossings farther south by sheer weight of artillery and assault boats, he seized on the only lever left to him: terror against his own. That is what made March 22nd different. This was not about one bridge anymore. This was the day the order hardened. In the bunker, after dictating that every officer connected with the Remagen disaster be executed, Hitler went further. He dictated a new standing order. Any commander who allowed a bridge to fall into enemy hands intact was to be court-martialed on the spot and shot. No exceptions. No considerations of fuel shortages, failed explosives, overwhelming force. The fact that by then there were hardly any major bridges left to defend did not matter. It was about asserting control over a reality that had slipped far beyond his grasp. For the generals standing around the table, the order was more than brutal. It was surreal. They knew the truth. The Rhine was already broken in multiple places. Allied engineers were flinging Bailey bridges and pontoon crossings over it faster than German rear guards could blow them. The Western Front was collapsing into pockets. Scapegoating a handful of officers at Remagen would not change the tonnage of American bombs, the number of American tanks, or the simple fact that in 1944 alone, the United States had produced nearly 18 million tons of shipping and more trucks than Germany had produced in the entire war. But subordinates like Jadl and Keitel wrote the order down anyway. They would pass it on. Some officers, given the choice between obeying it and surrendering with their men, would ignore it in the weeks to come. Others would die trying to comply. In post-war interrogations, several general staff officers would point to Remagen not just March 7th, when the bridge was seized, but the following weeks, culminating in that meeting on March 22nd as the moment when the illusion of a defensible Western Front finally shattered. Before Remagen, they could tell themselves the Rhine would buy time. After Remagen, they knew time had run out. From a purely military standpoint, the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge did not win the war. The Allies would have crossed the Rhine elsewhere, sooner or later. German industry was already broken. The Red Army was already on the Oder. But the bridge changed the timing, and timing in war is lives. American analysts later estimated that crossing the Rhine at Remagen shortened the conflict in the West by several weeks, perhaps a month. In that month, thousands more would have died on both sides. Symbolically, Remagen did something even more important. It exposed in steel and stone the gap between Hitler's rhetoric and reality. For years, he had promised the German people that they would never see a foreign soldier set foot on the east bank of the Rhine. On March 7th, they did. On March 22nd, he responded not by reassessing his strategy, not by seeking a way to end the slaughter, but by ordering the execution of his own officers and threatening any who dared to surrender crumbling ruins. The river that was supposed to protect Germany had been turned into a measuring stick. On one side, American pontoon bridges, Bailey spans, and a flood of men and vehicles moving east. On other, firing squads lined up in the shadows of a collapsed bridge, shooting men whose real crime was failing to hold back a tide no one could stop. History would remember the steel trusses at Remagen. It would remember the photographs of GIs jogging across the Rhine with their rifles slung, grinning for cameras between artillery bursts. It would not remember the exact hour in the stale light of a bunker when Hitler broke a pencil and ordered every officer at Remagen shot. But for those in that room, March 22, 1945, was the day a different kind of bridge gave way, the last bridge between a collapsing front and the fantasies of the man still pretending to command it.